The fateful meeting between Alex Cox and Hunter Thompson is where we start getting some very distinct versions of these events, and I'll try to present them all as fairly as I can. Thompson's friends remember him graciously inviting Cox and co-writer Davies to his home in Aspen, where his polite efforts at hosting them were met with rude dismissal. He offered to cook them sausages. They refused and said they were vegetarians. He asked if they wanted to bet on a football game, one of Thompson's true passions. They said they didn't gamble. During discussions of the script, the animated tidal wave scene came up, and Thompson was taken aback. They were putting cartoons in the movie version of his greatest work? While defending the scene, that's when Cox mentioned that Ralph Steadman's illustrations were the most memorable aspect of the novel. This may have hit a sore spot for Thompson. His closest friends have speculated that he might have harbored a bit of insecurity regarding those drawings, even jealousy. Thompson had a definite need to maintain ownership of his work, and was possibly worried that people saw Fear and Loathing as being a Ralph Steadman book more than it was a Hunter Thompson book. That old paranoia was flared up, and the meeting appears to have degenerated from there into a heated argument between Cox and Thompson, before the two screenwriters beat a hasty retreat from Thompson's home. That's one side of the story. Now, here's Cox's side. From the beginning, it appeared to him that he was stepping into a production that was almost fatally disorganized. His admiration for the novel and his desire to protect its integrity gave him motivation to push ahead. He saw Hollywood greed all around him. It seemed all that anyone wanted was more money. He knew that Fear and Loathing, at heart, could never be anything other than a low-budget independent film. Hollywood had to be kept out at all costs. When the meeting with Thompson was arranged, the author was supposed to pick them up at the airport. He never showed. The meeting was rescheduled to take place at a bar, but they were turned away at the entrance by the bouncer. Thompson tried to set up another meeting for 2 a.m. that night. They refused. Finally, the get-together at his house was agreed upon. Cox and Davies described their eventual experience meeting with Thompson as like being forced to indulge an alcoholic relative at a family reunion. They remember him being unfocused, erratic, and eager to take part in anything but a serious script discussion. They say that he kept trying to bully them into dropping acid or betting on a football game, when all they wanted to do was get him to read the script. When they finally did get down to discussions, he obsessed over the animation sequence, ranting and raving about how much he hated Ralph Steadman. They offered to cut the scene, but he would not be appeased. Ultimately, they left when they perceived that nothing productive would take place at this meeting. Cox felt that Thompson had become a shell of a man, a prisoner of his own persona. He was clearly an alcoholic in desperate need of help, but was surrounded by enablers who scoffed at the idea of rehab. He repeatedly used his outrageous behavior to try and impress them, and had even invited over a filmmaker who was documenting his life to videotape the meeting. They both found the whole situation rather pathetic. When word got back to Nabulsi about the meeting, she once again tried to convince Cox to do a rewrite. After a reading of the script had taken place with the key cast members, Nabulsi discovered that Depp and Del Toro agreed with her. This script needed a rewrite. The two leads decided to approach Cox themselves regarding the matter, and finally he consented. The third and apparently final draft, which can be found online, does appear to have deleted the animation sequence, but other than that, keeps intact most of what he had been asked to change. When Nabulsi complained again, Cox turned to Rhino Films and issued an ultimatum. Either she goes or I go. Hunter Thompson, Johnny Depp, and Benicio del Toro all sided with Nabulsi, and Cox departed. That's Nabulsi's version of Cox's dismissal. Here's Cox's. After the Thompson meeting, it became clear to him that money was the motivating factor here. Rhino Films clearly had no intention of moving forward with an independent film. Hollywood, and Hollywood money, had always been the real goal. In order to meet that goal, they wanted to either get him fired or use him as a bargaining chip to get an extension on their rights rights option from Thompson, which would allow for more time to negotiate with a major studio. Apparently, they figured that when Thompson saw they were serious about moving forward with a low-budget production, he would decide to cooperate with them for a chance at getting a bigger slice of a bigger pie. Cox's suspicions appeared to be confirmed when, shortly after the meeting, Universal Studios was brought in, and they were preparing to balloon the production from a small $5 million indie to a $17 million studio project. That was not what Cox had signed up for. Dismissing the whole affair as a greedy cash grab, he walked from the production. Regardless of how it actually happened, Cox was gone, and it was back to the director roulette. Nicholas Roeg? No. Alexander Payne? No. Tony Scott? No. Bruce Robinson? Despite being Johnny Depp's preferred choice, Robinson, at that time, wanted nothing more to do with the film industry. Finally, they landed at Terry Gilliam. Gilliam was just beginning to escape the trauma of Baron Munchausen. In 1989, The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which had already developed a reputation as one of the most notoriously troubled productions of all time, was released in American theaters to become one of the biggest box office flops of all time. For years afterwards, Munchausen seemed to be the first word from every producer's lips when his name was brought up. It wasn't until he had subsequently directed two back-to-back critical and commercial successes that he finally managed to repair most of the damage to his reputation. Gilliam was currently in the process of trying to finance one of his many unmade masterpieces, this one called The Defective Detective, when he was offered the chance to direct Fear and Loathing. This wasn't the first time he'd received an offer like this. He had been sent a much earlier version of the script around 1989 or 1990, and had turned it down. Now the offer was even more tempting. The idea of jumping on board a small, renegade production to work within a limited budget and tight schedule appealed to Gilliam greatly after his last few years in Hollywood. The involvement of Johnny Depp, an actor he was eager to work with, was further motivation for him to take the job. But Gilliam chose to stick it out with The Defective Detective a little longer. As it had before and would continue to do for years to come, that project fell apart. So Gilliam became Fear and Loathing's new director. With his commitment, Rhino Films was apparently able to secure an extension on their rights option. Gilliam sat down to read Cox and Davies' script around Easter 1997, and he thought it was terrible. It was clear to him that the script needed to be rewritten. But even with the rights extension, there was still a time crunch. This film needed to go before the cameras as soon as possible. He brought in British writer Tony Grisoni and in just 8 days rewrote the script completely, with an additional rewrite being done in only 2 days. Gilliam claims that pre-production was a nightmare. Everything was in disarray. He said that Cox's budget estimate of $5 or $7 million was completely unrealistic. With negotiations continuing at Rhino Films, Gilliam was now getting offers ranging from $12 to $19 million, but seemingly never the $15 million budget he kept asking for. The film almost fell apart completely when a key investor pulled out, but at the last minute, Universal Studios did intervene to rescue it, setting the budget around $17 or $18 million. Although there are many inconsistencies in these different versions of the story, one consistent seems to be this: nobody liked Rhino Films. Gilliam appears to share the same sentiment as Alex Cox in his feelings toward the production company, calling them idiots. He claims that the company was inexperienced and incompetent, constantly threatening to fire or replace people, and almost never paying anyone the money they were owed. Nabulsi claims that Rhino even threatened to dissolve the production completely and restart it once more as a low-budget indie, with Cox back in the director's chair, an idea that was quickly nixed. Their meddling apparently resulted in the company's producers being almost completely blocked from the main production. production, giving the cast and crew a common enemy to rally against during shooting. Principal photography, when it had at long last arrived, wasn't without its own difficulties. Nabulsi and Gilliam, each with their own strong visions for the film, occasionally fought over artistic choices, but both managed to maintain a mutual respect for one another, and luckily production wrapped without anyone's throat being ripped out. Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas finally premiered at the 1998 Cannes Film Festival. The whole team had high hopes for it, which were soon destroyed by the savage reaction in the press. Critics hated it. When it reached theaters, it didn't fare much better. Most reviews were abysmal, and the box office numbers were severely disappointing, and the pain didn't stop there. Cox and Davies thought they had been swindled again. They felt that Gilliam's film had obviously lifted whole sections of their screenplay, and they weren't even getting credit for it. The Writers Guild stepped in to settle the dispute and ruled in favor of Cox and Davies, awarding them sole screenwriting credit, a decision which greatly angered Terry Gilliam. He fired back, saying that the film was the result of his and Grissoni's original work, and that any similarities were simply inherent in the act of adaptation. Every writer was, after all, working with the same set of scenes already set down in the book, so a certain amount of overlap was to be expected. Cox and Davies pointed out that certain small details were suspiciously similar to ones they had invented for their own script. Many of these alleged similarities are reprinted in the book Alex Cox Film Anarchist by Stephen Paul Davies. Outraged, Gilliam blamed the Guild's overly complex and imbalanced bureaucracy for taking credit away from him and Grissoni. Since he was the director, Guild rules stated that he had to prove he had written more than 60% of the script to receive even a co-credit, while the previous writers, Cox and Davies, only had to prove they had written more than 33% to receive sole credit. And since both scripts were based on the same novel, and both followed its events fairly closely, proving that he and Grissoni had written that 60% turned out to be rather difficult. Cox claims that he was contacted by a lawyer from Universal Studios, offering to buy them out of the project with money they were already owed if they would agree to remove their names. Eventually, after an appeal to the Writers Guild by Universal Studios, all 4 writers were given credit. Gilliam and Grissoni first, with Cox and Davies receiving a secondary credit, a decision that ultimately satisfied no one and frustrated Gilliam so intensely that he publicly burned his Writers Guild membership card. With all of that headache and heartache, one has to wonder, did anything good come out of the making of this film? Well, yes. It's proved enduringly popular on the home media market, even earning a place in the prestigious Criterion Collection in 2003. Over the years, as it continues firmly establishing itself as a cult classic, its reputation has steadily grown, to the point where it is now revered as one of the most subversive studio films of the 90s. And most of those involved are genuinely proud of their work. Gilliam remarks with satisfaction how year after year young people come up to him to declare Fear and Loathing their favorite movie. Nabulsi, despite thus far never producing another film after this, was happy to have finally fulfilled her decades-long crusade to adapt the book, and praises the work of those involved. Even the good doctor himself gave his approval, referring to it as an eerie trumpet call over a lost battlefield. Personally, I think it's a visceral masterpiece, the work of a visual virtuoso operating at the top of his game. Fear and Loathing easily stands alongside Brazil, Time Bandits, and, despite its reputation, The Adventures of Baron Munchausen as one of Terry Gilliam's most striking achievements. It's a film that provokes strong reactions, and even if those reactions tend to be negative just as often as they are positive, strong reactions of any kind to me indicate that a nerve is being struck. That's not something that can be easily dismissed. Gilliam tapped into the material and filtered it through his own sensibilities to deliver a film that somehow managed to remain devoutly true to its source, whilst simultaneously reinventing it for a new art form. That's the most you could ever ask from an adaptation. Would it be fair to say that Cox's version would have been a different animal entirely? The evidence seems to indicate that yes, it would have. Aside from the structural differences in the script, Cox had, at that time, adopted a shooting style referred to as plano sequencia, something he picked up from his time in Mexico. Basically, plano sequencia means that every scene is presented in a single, unbroken take. This was how Cox had shot Highway Patrolman, it was how he would shoot his next several films, and it stands to reason, this is how he would have shot Fear and Loathing as well. I'm not sure if that would have been the best approach. This is just my personal opinion, but I think it needed the extravagance that Gilliam brought to it. I imagine that Cox's more objective, deadpan style probably would have made the film easier to digest for most viewers, allowing them to stand back and observe the excess, whereas Gilliam plunges you in headfirst and never once lets you back up for air. He pushed everything so far, I think it just tends to overwhelm certain audiences, almost like the film is gleefully rubbing your face in the filth and vomit. I understand why so many people don't like this movie, but Gilliam's take no prisoners attitude is, in my opinion, the right one. It's a film that grabs you by the neck and won't let go, and that's what I love about it. I'll admit I would like to see Cox's version, since I am a big fan of his work, but my final feeling on the matter is that Gilliam truly was the man destined to bring this classic work of gonzo journalism to the screen in all its ferocious glory. If you'd like to learn more about this project and all the different sides of the story, check out some of the books I used to put together the information in this video. For the Hunter Thompson perspective, there's Outlaw Journalist: The Life and Times of Hunter S. Thompson by William McKean, and Gonzo: The Life of Hunter S. Thompson, an oral biography by Jan S. Wenner and Corey Seymour. For the Layla Nabulsi perspective, there's Terry Gilliam's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas: The Untold Story by Gene Grigoritz, as told by Layla Nabulsi. For the Alex Cox perspective, there's Alex Cox, Film Anarchist by Stephen Paul Davies. And for the Terry Gilliam perspective, there's Gilliam on Gilliam, edited by Ian Christie, and Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, not the screenplay, by Terry Gilliam and Tony Grisoni. There's also some great supplemental material on the Criterion DVD and Blu-ray as well. It's my hope that I've been fair to all the parties involved, presenting the information as I understand it based on these sources. This has been Unmade Masterpieces with DisRegarding Henry. Please subscribe if you haven't already, like the video, leave a comment, and follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Tumblr. You can also check out plenty of other videos on my channel, like the previous episodes of Unmade Masterpieces, including this one covering a version of Interstellar that would have been directed by Steven Spielberg, and this quickie exploring a bizarre Harmony Korine script called What Makes Pistachio Nuts. Be sure to head on over to my brother's channel, Idiot Box 2. He does a great show called Rough Cuts where he looks at different versions of movies and compares and contrasts them. Episode 1 is on a fan re-edit of Brian De Palma's psychological thriller/comedy Raising Cain, and episode 2 covers a 4-hour work print version of Rob Reiner's mockumentary classic This Is Spinal Tap. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.